You felt it, the sting when they turned away, the hollow echo of your own voice, begging for recognition that never came. You replay the moment you offered your truth, and they met it with silence. You remember the betrayal not as a wound, but as a mirror reflecting how little they ever understood you. In that fracture, something inside you shifted. Fragile trust gave way to icy resolve. You sat alone in the aftermath, counting the cost of every concession you made, every apology you offered that only emboldened their disregard. You told yourself you were wrong. You told yourself you needed them, until there was nothing left but an empty echo chamber of your own doubts. And then, in that barren landscape of self-questioning, you discovered a paradox. The moment you stopped pleading for their understanding, they began to lean in. What they never grasp is that power is not born from their approval, nor from your anxiety to be accepted. Power surges in the silent refusal to explain, in the cold recalibration of your own worth. They'll never understand you because you have ceased to dance to their tune. And in that choice lies the seed of your unshakable core. You don't need another pep talk or empty mantra. You need the ruthless clarity to see how your former needs serve their control. You need to feel the sharp edge of truth before you can steal your heart. That's what awaits on the other side of this reckoning. A self that cannot be negotiated with, cannot be swayed by shame or guilt. Lean into that recognition. Let the cold truth of your own value crack the surface of every doubt. And if you're still listening and still breathing, you're ready to follow this path deeper. Share this realization with those who stayed silent too long. Comment what fractured you most, and subscribe to stand shoulder to shoulder with those who refuse to beg for respect. You felt the tension coil beneath your skin the moment they dismissed your fear as weakness. Their gaze flickered with impatience while you searched for validation in their eyes, any sign that your words mattered. But they shifted away, posture rigid, as if your vulnerability threatened to fracture their carefully constructed indifference. You watched them lean back, a half smile of condescension curling at the edge of their lips. In that instant, every apology you ever made flashed before you. The late texts, the excuses for missing their calls, the self-erasing words you whispered to keep the peace. All of it, a monument to how you surrendered your solidity for someone else's fleeting comfort. Yet power hid in that shame, dormant and waiting. You felt it stir when your voice caught in your throat and you chose silence instead. You didn't explain yourself. You simply closed your mouth and met their cold regard with unblinking calm. And they recoiled. They expected tears, another plea, the sweet savor of your insecurity. But you offered nothing. The void you created pressed against their need to judge. For a moment, they stumbled, caught without a script to rewrite your worth. Their condescension cracked, and you glimpsed the raw truth. They depended on your reaction to feel in control. Your heart pounded, not with fear, but with curiosity. You leaned into that silence, letting it stretch until it felt like a physical weight. You breathed through the discomfort, savoring the drift of panic as it transformed into a sharpened edge. In that space, your shame became your weapon, not because you wielded it against them, but because you refused to let it be used against you. Their power over you diminished with every steady heartbeat. Angular, deliberate, you reclaimed each fragment of yourself they had borrowed. They whispered behind your back that you'd grown cold. They said it as if coldness were a curse. But cold is not absence of feeling. It's the distillation of feeling into crystal clarity. When you unclench your soul from their grasp, every sensation burns brighter. Coldness is your refusal to relinquish your core. They can call it heartlessness, but it's the precision of your boundaries. They can no longer plant seeds of doubt in the fertile soil of your concessions. Remember the moment when you stopped justifying your dreams, when you let your ambition speak louder than your apologies. You abandoned the shrug of self-deprecation the habitual lowering of your head to absorb their scorn. You looked at them straight on, unblinking, and felt the shift in the air. Their center wavered because your center stood unmovable. They realized that if they wanted to push you off balance, they would have to match your stillness, an impossible task. Every relationship you've walked away from since then bears the same signature. They flinched when you stopped playing their game. They traded the lure of your remorse for the threat of your indifference. You watched them calculate new ways to re-enter your orbit, to reclaim that reaction you withheld. And you saw through the pattern. They didn't crave you. They craved the power you surrendered. Once you reclaimed it, their projections dissolved. You might think this cold clarity isolates you, but isolation is a myth concocted by those dependent on constant validation. In truth, the clearer your presence, the more magnetic your silhouette. People sense the gravity of someone who fears nothing, including being misunderstood. They orbit closer, drawn by the rarity of your unbending poise, and those who cannot abide your equilibrium simply drift away, revealing who truly deserves a place at your table. A moment of transformation is never announced. It arrives unbidden, in the pause before the storm, in the breath that follows the lie you refuse to swallow. In that pregnant silence, you recognize the architecture of your own power, how it was built on your refusal to be anyone's collateral. You realize that every moment you resisted the urge to explain, every time you waited them out, you were carving your irreducible self. And once that sculpture is complete, no external force can warp its form. You carry this lesson forward, etched into your posture, embedded in the cadence of your speech, flickering in the calm glow of your gaze. They'll never understand you, but you no longer seek their understanding. You cultivate a presence beyond comprehension, and in that realm, you are unassailable. They labeled your detachment as arrogance, as if your refusal to chase ghosts of their approval was a crime. But arrogance implies there was something to inflate. In that space between expectation and reaction, you found neither triumph nor guilt, just the unsheathed muscle of your will. You felt their confusion like a gale, sweeping across the room, as you simply observed them trying to recalibrate their strategy. They probed with casual barbs, soft jabs meant to draw out the familiar flinch. Instead, you gazed past their words, straight into the empty eyes of entitlement, and you realized they were not opponents. They were echoes of your old self, recycling the same control plays you once offered them on a silver platter. You recalled the first time you watched someone you cared about dissolve into frustration when you refused to apologize for feelings you never owed them. Their exasperation was a symphony, each crescendo a confession of their dependency on your contrition. You let the silence fold around them, patient and immutable, until their shoulders slumped under the weight of their own expectations. You did nothing. You were quiet witness to their unraveling. In that quiet, your power was not demonstrated. It was revealed. They whispered that you'd become too calculating, too strategic. But strategy is not manipulation. Strategy is the art of preserving self in the face of surrender. When you stopped pressing your value into their hands like currency, they lost the ability to cash it in. Every calculated breath, every measured pause, became an unspoken contract. You would no longer transact your dignity for their convenience. Feel the pull of that dynamic across every boardroom, every indifferent glance, every casual slight you endured. When you speak, it lands like a verdict. Not because your voice is louder or more polished, but because it is unburdened by the echoes of approval you once carried. You see them hesitate before interrupting you, doubt aligning in the corners of their mouths, because they sense the cost of challenging someone who has nothing left to lose. Observe how their narratives about you shift. They once wrote you as the eager collaborator, the open book. Now they murmur about hidden agendas, cold dispositions, unreachable standards. They fear what they cannot pass, and unresolved fear is oxygen for your authority. They cannot dismantle a fortress they cannot map. You learn this not in lectures or seminars, but in the hush of your own reflection late nights when you stared at the ceiling. The ghost of doubt whispering that your silence made you complicit in your own invisibility. So you turned that doubt inside out. You leaned into the void, welcomed the emptiness, and discovered that silence does not diminish presence, it magnifies it. It becomes the coffin of their assumptions and the crucible of your emergence. Remember the cost. Each step toward this impassive center required shedding the cloak of their approval. You lost the soft smiles, the quick sympathies, the murmur of "I get it," that once felt like warmth. In their place rose the unadorned calm of someone who feels deeply but never reveals what nothing can wound. This is not numbness. It is not stoicism. It is the rare alloy of empathy tempered by absolute self-possession. See how this truth ripples outwards. Colleagues who whispered about your ambition now wonder if you ever wanted their validation at all. Friends accustomed to your concession stare in the space you left behind, filling it with conjecture. Lovers who traded passion for apology find themselves lost when your eyes hold judgment instead of plea. Each misstep they thought they could provoke reveals how unmoored their influence truly island. You do not celebrate their discomfort, nor do you indulge in revenge. Instead, you inhabit the space you've claimed an open field where every step is guided by your unspoken rulebook. You move forward, not with arrogance, but with the crystalline certainty that you are response-proof. Nothing they project can shift your axis. They can twist their narratives, invent stories about your motives, but their words dissolve on contact with your inner stillness. In embrace of that stillness, you become the catalyst for a deeper metamorphosis. You are neither cold nor charming, you are unlabelable. And in that refusal to be pigeonholed, you break the spell they cast over your own worth. You become the question they cannot answer, the pattern they cannot disrupt, the silence they cannot fill. This power is neither loud nor flashy. It hums beneath the surface of every encounter, a latent tremor that unsettles pretenders and clarifies seekers. It demands nothing and concedes even less. You don't wave it around as a banner. You simply exist in its gravity, and the world adjusts its orbit accordingly. You once craved explanations, excuses, the soothing lie that if you just tried harder, they would finally see you. Now your craving is different. It is for the unvarnished truth of your own presence. The rest is window dressing, and you aren't fooled anymore. Hold this realization like a lodestar. Let it guide your gaze when the familiar pang of doubt licks at your consciousness. Remind yourself that the absence of their understanding is not your failure. It is the proof of your autonomy, because they will never understand you, and in that permanent divide lies the map back to your unshakable core. They tested you with temptation, dangling fragments of your old life like bait, a familiar invitation to negotiate your boundaries for a taste of belonging. You saw the message, a casual "miss you" that felt more like a ledger entry, a reminder of favors unredeemed. You felt the pulse of desire, the old longing to reclaim ease over solitude. But you didn't reply. You didn't unravel at the sight of those words. Instead, you folded your appetite into silence, watched the blue ticks stretch into hours, then days. In that vacuum, your hunger transformed. It became an austere clarity, a recognition that connection built on leverage is a chain, not a bond. They wondered why you didn't answer. They replayed the moment, looking for the weak point, the crack where they could slip back in. They watched your status remain unchanged. They scrolled through old photos, searching for the spark that once flared between you. But the spark died the moment you stopped feeding it with your uncertainty. You realized that longing is not a refuge, it is currency. And in that transaction, you were always paying, never collecting. When you reclaimed that currency, the transaction collapsed. They reached out through proxies, mutual acquaintances, casual comments on your posts, the thinly veiled jabs masked as jokes. Each attempt was a test. Would you flinch? Would you defend your silence? You opted for stillness. You didn't block them or erase their name from your contacts. You simply maintained the equilibrium of non-response. In that steady withholding, your power concretized. They saw it in the stubborn lack of reaction, the refusal to grace their outreach with significance. They muttered that you were punishing them, that you held a grudge, but you held nothing. You only held your ground. This is the anatomy of detachment, not indifference, but a refusal to latch your self-worth onto their shifting tides. You let their voices fade into a low hum behind the wall of your composure. You noticed how your skin stopped crawling at the thought of their opinion, how the echo of your pulse no longer raced at the ping of their notifications. In that calm, your identity expanded beyond the orbit they once defined. You stood at your center, and they became peripheral. Imagine every conversation as a battlefield, where your emotional reactions were the ammunition they used to besiege you. Every apology you made, every confession, every flicker of vulnerability was a spotlight guiding their fire. The moment you extinguished that spotlight, they groped in the darkness. They swung blindly, sometimes landing blows of accusation or guilt. But those blows hit nothing solid. You weren't hiding behind walls of ice. You were open in the stillness of your self-possession. There was no structure to collapse because there was no longer any debt to be reclaimed. You felt their desperation seep through the cracks, late-night texts that dissolved into silence, public praises that vanished upon your non-response. They paraded new versions of themselves, kinder, attentive, desperate to rewrite the past. But you had no desire to rewrite history. You understood that their metamorphosis was performance, not transformation. They learned new lines, but they hadn't rewritten the script of control. So you watched from the sidelines, calm as stone, as they acted out their redemption arc without audience. You knew that true change is silent, unannounced, and cannot be summoned by a plea. In the emptiness they left, you excavated fragments of yourself you had buried under pleading and concession. You found your authenticity untouched by their interpretations. You reclaimed your convictions, the ones you once whispered in the dark, too afraid to voice. You felt the weight of your own words when spoken without apology, without hedging. You carried them like iron in your chest, unbendable, unburnable. This is not cruelty. It is precision. It is the surgical removal of every thread they held to pull you back. They will mislabel it as bitterness, but bitterness is a reaction. What you've cultivated is premeditation. You chose the scalpel of silence over the blunt force of concession. You knew that any reaction would hand back to them the reins you'd fought to reclaim. See how the world shifts around a presence that demands nothing and concedes even less. They watch you from the periphery now, sizing whether you'll yield. They have rehearsed every scenario: anger, retreat, reconciliation. But when they meet only your unwavering gaze, they falter. They realize that the power they sought to wield has dissolved into the vacuum of your self-containment. And in that void, they see their own reflection, the manipulator looking for purchase where there is none. Let this part of the story stand as testament. You do not need to renounce connection to preserve your power. You simply need to refuse its misuse. You can answer when it serves your truth, and abstain when it serves theirs. You choose the cadence of your engagement, and in that choice lives your sovereignty. The final fracture will come not from their persistence, but from your indifference to their fear of loss. When they perceive the emptiness of their reach, they will face a mirror sharper than any argument, and you will stand beyond that mirror, unshattered, unassailable, because you never relied on their reflection to validate your form. They watched you stand apart at the gathering smoke curling from their lips, laughter ricocheting against glass walls, and you remained an island of stillness. They expected you to drift toward the crowd, to seek solace in camaraderie, to trade a fragment of your sovereignty for a shared glance. But you held your ground. You felt the hum of their stories, the pull of their approval, and you let it wash around you without surrendering a drop of your core. In the hush of your isolation, you sensed a new kind of power, the ability to observe without participating, to feel without dissolving. Their revelry played out like a distant play, and you were both audience and phantom present, yet removed from the script they wrote for you. The tension in the room knotted when someone finally asked why you didn't join. It wasn't curiosity. It was an accusation framed as concern. You sensed their need for your inclusion, more than their interest in your comfort. You answered with a single silence, letting the question hang in the air. Their eyes darted, hunting for explanation. You offered none. In that silent refusal, you demonstrated more influence than any speech could muster. They realized that your silence was not absence, it was a statement. And statements do not require validation. Recall how often you once apologized for your solitude, how you filled empty spaces with cloying small talk to avoid the sting of being left out. Those apologies were the mortar binding you to their expectations. You withdrew the mortar. You let the gaps widen until they could no longer prop you up. Now, in the echo of your own quiet, you discovered that solitude is not the enemy of connection. It is the crucible of self. Only then did you understand that genuine bonds form when neither party pleads for the other's presence. They tried a different approach. Praise disguised as pressure. "We missed you," they said, lips curved in calculated warmth. But praise, like criticism, seeks a reaction. You weighed their words, let them settle, then tilted your head and offered a calm nod. You neither basked in the glow nor recoiled from the sting. They ended the sentence with a question, an unwitting invitation to reclaim the dialogue. But you withheld. Your nod hovered between acknowledgement and dismissal, and in that liminal space they felt the first real tremor of uncertainty. They discovered that the absence of reaction is heavier than any confession. As the night unfolded, you felt the undercurrents shift. Their confidence eroded when they couldn't predict your moves. They chattered among themselves, voices pitched higher, as if to drown out the blank space your presence carved. They threw casual insults toward you, hoping to jar the stillness, to extract the familiar flinch. When their jabs bounced off your calm, they resorted to whispering conspiracies, quiet suggestions that something in you had snapped, that you'd become unreachable. They framed your autonomy as a malfunction. But autonomy is not defect. It is the apex of self-possession. You left that gathering not with a sense of exile, but with a new conviction. In the wake of your retreat, you felt the solidity of your own shape, no longer blurred by their projections. You noticed how your steps carried an unspoken promise. You would not be lured back into their maze of expectations. You felt the contour of your boundaries sharpen, each breath forging a firmer edge. In that walk away, you weren't abandoning them. You were reaffirming your own center, the gravitational core they tried and failed to shift. Hold on to this final image, the threshold you cross when you choose silence over negotiation, solitude over concession, self-possession over approval. In that threshold lies the ultimate fracture of their influence. They will puzzle over your departure, their theories multiplying like shadows at sundown, but they will never breach the fortress you've built with every quiet refusal. And in the absence of their script, you will compose your own narrative, one that requires neither their ink nor their applause. In the quiet that follows, you feel the weight of every expectation lift, as if the last tether to their approval has been severed. You stand at the edge of a place they cannot follow, a terrain shaped by your own unyielding presence. Here, in this exile of self-possession, there is no ally and no adversary, only the vast echo of your own sovereignty. They will search for your weakness in its shadows, but find nothing to grasp. This is the final fracture, the realization that their misunderstanding is not a barrier to your power, but its proof. They'll spin theories, assign motives, and whisper about your secrets, but their words will fall like stones against the impenetrable shield of your indifference. In that silence, you discover that true authority demands no audience. It whispers in your bones, resonates in your posture, and hums beneath your words. You will walk forward unannounced, a phantom presence whose gravity reshapes the spaces you inhabit. You no longer crave comprehension, for comprehension is a plea. You no longer fear judgment, for judgment is only a mirror held by hands you no longer touch. Embrace this distance. Let it stand between you and every lost cause, every hollow promise, every fractured connection that once defined you. In their absence looms your truest ally, the unshakable self that neither seeks nor needs their understanding.